Have you ever wondered why some of the kindest people on earth seem to attract the most toxic individuals? Why does the person who cares deeply, forgives easily, and always tries to see the good in others often end up trapped in relationships that leave them emotionally exhausted? And why do narcissists seem to have an almost supernatural ability to find these people? At first glance, it doesn't make sense. You would think that highly empathetic people would be the hardest to manipulate. After all, they understand emotions. They can sense when someone is hurting. They often notice subtle changes in behavior that others miss. So why do so many empaths find themselves tangled in relationships with narcissists? The answer is both fascinating and unsettling, because what makes an empath beautiful is often exactly what makes them vulnerable, and what attracts a healthy person to an empath is not always the same thing that attracts a narcissist. A healthy person sees warmth. A narcissist sees opportunity. A healthy person sees compassion. A narcissist sees access. A healthy person sees loyalty. A narcissist sees supply. And that's where the story begins. Most people imagine narcissists walking around consciously looking for victims. But reality is often more subtle than that. Many narcissists aren't sitting down and saying, "Today I'm going to manipulate someone." Instead, they are drawn towards certain personality traits the same way a magnet is drawn toward metal. And one of the strongest magnets of all is excessive empathy, not empathy by itself. Overly developed empathy, the kind that causes someone to constantly put other people's feelings before their own, the kind that makes someone feel guilty for having boundaries, the kind that turns understanding into self-sacrifice. This is where the danger starts, because narcissists don't necessarily fall in love with the empath. They fall in love with what the empath provides. Think about it. Imagine you're someone who constantly needs attention, validation, admiration, and emotional support. Who would seem more attractive? Someone who says, "I have needs too," or someone who says, "Tell me everything, I'm here for you"? The answer is obvious. The narcissist feels seen, understood, admired, validated, maybe for the first time in a long time. And the empath often feels something too. They feel needed, important, connected, special. What neither person realizes in the beginning is that they're often falling in love with a role rather than a reality. The narcissist falls in love with being emotionally fed. The empath falls in love with being emotionally needed. At first, it feels perfect, almost magical. People often describe these relationships as intense from the very beginning. The connection feels deeper than normal. Conversations last for hours. Personal stories are shared quickly. The emotional bond seems unusually strong. But what appears to be intimacy is sometimes something very different, because real intimacy develops gradually. What many empaths experience with narcissists is accelerated emotional attachment. And there's a huge difference. The narcissist creates a feeling of closeness before trust has truly been earned. The empath mistakes that intensity for genuine connection. And once that happens, emotional investment begins growing rapidly. Here's what makes overly empathetic people especially vulnerable. They naturally assume others think the way they do. This psychological tendency is incredibly common. If you're honest, loyal, and caring, you tend to project those qualities onto others. You assume people have good intentions. You assume people mean what they say. You assume people value relationships the same way you do. Most of the time, this isn't a problem. But around a narcissist, it can become dangerous, because narcissists often understand empathy far better than people realize. Not because they possess it, because they've learned how to use it. They understand what compassionate people want to hear. They understand what makes empathetic individuals feel connected. They understand what creates emotional investment. And they know how to mirror it. That's one reason so many empaths later say something shocking. The person I fell in love with doesn't exist anymore. But often the reality is even more painful. That person may never have existed in the first place. The narcissist simply reflected back the qualities the empath wanted to see. Like a mirror. Like an actor playing the perfect role. And because empaths naturally focus on potential rather than patterns, they often miss the warning signs. This is one of the most overlooked reasons narcissists find empaths irresistible. Empaths are dreamers. Not necessarily in a fantasy sense, but in a psychological sense. They see who someone could become. They see hidden goodness, hidden pain, hidden potential, even when evidence suggests otherwise. A narcissist can exploit this without even consciously planning to. Every broken promise becomes a temporary mistake. Every red flag becomes a misunderstanding. Every act of selfishness becomes a sign of hidden wounds. The empath keeps searching for the good person underneath. Meanwhile, the narcissist keeps benefiting from the doubt. And the cycle continues. What makes this even more complicated is that many narcissists appear deeply wounded. In fact, that's often part of their appeal. Empaths are natural healers. When they encounter someone carrying obvious emotional pain, their instincts activate immediately. They want to help. They want to understand. They want to fix what's broken. But here's a truth that many people learn too late. Some wounds create humility. Others create entitlement. And if you mistake entitlement for pain, you can spend years trying to heal someone who has no interest in changing. This is one of the biggest traps overly empathetic people fall into. They confuse understanding with responsibility. Understanding why someone behaves badly doesn't excuse the behavior. Understanding someone's trauma doesn't require tolerating abuse. Understanding someone's pain doesn't mean sacrificing your own well-being. Yet many empaths do exactly that. Because they believe love means enduring. They believe loyalty means staying. They believe compassion means unlimited patience. A narcissist thrives in that environment. Why wouldn't they? Imagine being with someone who constantly gives second chances. Someone who constantly questions themselves instead of questioning you. Someone who repeatedly prioritizes your emotions over their own. That's incredibly attractive to a person who wants control. And that's why the relationship often becomes unbalanced so quickly. At first, the empath gives because they care. Then they give because they're invested. Then they give because they hope things will improve. Then they give because they've already invested so much. Before they know it, they're trapped in a cycle that feels impossible to escape. One of the most fascinating psychological dynamics between empaths and narcissists involves emotional labor. The empath becomes responsible for maintaining the emotional stability of the entire relationship. When the narcissist is upset, the empath comforts them. When the narcissist is angry, the empath calms them. When the narcissist is insecure, the empath reassures them. When conflict arises, the empath often becomes the peacemaker. At first, this may feel normal, but over time, a disturbing pattern emerges. The empath is carrying two emotional loads, their own and the narcissist's. Meanwhile, the narcissist often carries neither. And because overly empathetic people are accustomed to helping others, they may not notice how unfair this arrangement has become, until they're exhausted, until they're overwhelmed, until they wake up one day wondering why they feel emotionally empty. This is another reason narcissists find empaths irresistible. Empaths often tolerate imbalance far longer than most people, not because they're weak, because they're hopeful. Hope is one of the most beautiful human qualities. But in the wrong relationship, hope can become a trap. The empath keeps believing tomorrow will be different. The narcissist keeps benefiting from today. Months pass, years pass, the dynamic remains unchanged, and yet the empath stays. Not because they're blind, not because they're foolish, because they genuinely believe people can change. That's what makes this so heartbreaking. The very quality that makes empaths extraordinary is often the quality that gets used against them. Their compassion becomes a doorway, their patience becomes permission, their understanding becomes vulnerability, and their desire to heal becomes the chain that keeps them attached. But there's another reason narcissists are drawn to highly empathetic people that few discuss. Empaths provide emotional reflection. They listen deeply. They pay attention. They remember details. They notice feelings. For someone who craves validation, This is incredibly rewarding. The narcissist feels important, interesting, special. The empath unintentionally becomes a source of emotional fuel. And because the empath genuinely cares, that fuel often seems unlimited, at least in the beginning. What the narcissist doesn't realize is that even the deepest well can run dry. And what the empath doesn't realize is that they're approaching a realization that changes everything. A realization that many narcissists never see coming. Because eventually, after enough disappointment, enough confusion, enough emotional exhaustion, the empath begins noticing something that has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. They begin realizing that love without reciprocity is not love, that understanding without accountability is dangerous, that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And once that realization starts forming, the relationship enters an entirely new phase. A phase that neither the empath nor the narcissist is fully prepared for. Because the same person who once gave endlessly is about to start asking questions. Questions that threaten the very foundation of the relationship. Questions that expose uncomfortable truths. Questions that reveal whether the connection was ever built on genuine love at all. And when those questions finally emerge, everything begins to change. Because for the first time, the empath stops focusing entirely on the narcissist and begins paying attention to themselves. That may sound simple, but in relationships built around imbalance, it is revolutionary. For months, sometimes years, the empath has been studying the narcissist, analyzing their moods, understanding their triggers, anticipating their reactions, trying to keep the peace, trying to make things work. Now something shifts. Instead of asking, "Why are they acting this way?" the empath starts asking, "Why am I accepting this?" That single question has the power to unravel everything. Because narcissistic dynamics often survive through distraction. The empath becomes so focused on fixing the other person that they never stop to examine what the relationship is doing to them. But once self-awareness enters the picture, the illusion begins to crack. The empath starts noticing patterns. Patterns that once seemed like isolated incidents. Patterns that now appear impossible to ignore. They notice how every conflict somehow becomes their fault. They notice how their needs are constantly minimized. They notice how apologies rarely lead to change. They notice how promises are repeated but seldom fulfilled. Most importantly, they notice something that makes them deeply uncomfortable. The relationship only works when they are the one doing the work. And that realization hits hard, because empaths invest emotionally. They don't enter relationships casually. They give their time, energy, loyalty, and heart. To realize that much of that effort was one-sided can feel devastating. It's like waking up from a dream and discovering that the reality underneath is completely different from what you believed. At first, many empaths resist this realization, not because they enjoy suffering. Because accepting the truth means grieving the future they imagined. They aren't just letting go of a person. They're letting go of possibilities, the future they hoped for, the changes they believed would happen, the version of the relationship they kept waiting for. And that grief can be powerful. In fact, this is one reason narcissistic relationships are so difficult to leave. The empath isn't attached only to what is, they're attached to what could be. Unfortunately, could be is often where narcissists hold the most power. As long as the empath remains focused on potential, reality remains blurred. But eventually, reality wins. Reality always wins. The empath starts comparing words to actions, promises to outcomes, intentions to behavior, and suddenly things that once seemed confusing become painfully clear. They begin realizing that understanding someone's wounds doesn't require sacrificing their own happiness. They begin realizing that love is not supposed to feel like constant emotional labor. They begin realizing that healthy relationships involve mutual effort, mutual respect, mutual accountability, not endless giving from one side and endless taking from the other. This is often the moment narcissists start sensing that something is different. They may not understand exactly what is happening, but they feel it. The empath is no longer reacting the same way. no longer chasing, no longer over-explaining, no longer accepting every excuse, no longer ignoring every red flag, and that change creates tension, because narcissistic dynamics rely heavily on predictability. The narcissist expects certain reactions, certain responses, certain emotional patterns. When those patterns disappear, the sense of control begins disappearing too. This often leads to one of the most fascinating phases of the relationship. The narcissist tries harder, not necessarily to become healthier, but to regain influence. Sometimes this appears as increased affection, more compliments, more attention, more promises, more emotional intensity. For a brief moment, it may seem like everything is improving. The empath feels hopeful again. The connection feels stronger again. The future appears brighter again. But if genuine accountability is absent, the pattern eventually returns. And when it does, something inside the empath begins changing permanently. Their hope starts transforming into clarity. Their confusion starts transforming into awareness. Their attachment starts transforming into observation. Instead of being emotionally consumed by the relationship, they begin studying it, almost like an outside observer. And what they see isn't always pleasant. They notice how often they compromise compared to the other person. They notice how often their boundaries are challenged. They notice how frequently their emotions are dismissed. They notice how rarely their sacrifices are appreciated. Piece by piece, the fantasy loses its grip. And here's what many narcissists fail to understand. The empath's greatest strength was never their willingness to stay. It was their ability to see. For years, they may have ignored what they saw, explained it away, rationalized it, minimized it, but they saw it. They always saw it. The difference now is that they're finally trusting their own observations. That trust changes everything. Because once an empath trusts themselves, manipulation becomes far less effective, gaslighting becomes harder, guilt becomes weaker, emotional games become more obvious, and suddenly the narcissist is dealing with someone entirely different, someone who still understands them, still sees their wounds, still recognizes their struggles, but no longer allows those struggles to justify harmful behavior. That distinction is powerful. Understanding is no longer being confused with permission. Compassion is no longer being confused with compliance. Love is no longer being confused with self-sacrifice. The empath is evolving, and that evolution is precisely what makes them impossible to control. Ironically, this is often when the narcissist becomes most desperate, because the emotional supply they've relied upon is beginning to disappear. The constant reassurance, the endless patience, the unconditional understanding, the limitless second chances, all of it is becoming less available. Not because the empath has become cruel, because they've become aware. Awareness is dangerous to any unhealthy dynamic. It exposes things that were previously hidden. And once something has been clearly seen, it cannot be unseen. This is why so many empaths describe a specific moment they never forget, a moment where everything suddenly clicked, a moment where years of confusion made sense, a moment where they looked at the relationship and realized they had been carrying responsibilities that never belonged to them. After that moment, something remarkable happens. The empath begins reclaiming energy. Energy that was once spent managing someone else's emotions. Energy that was once spent fixing problems they didn't create. Energy that was once spent proving their worth. That energy starts flowing back toward themselves, toward healing, toward growth, toward peace. And this is where the narcissist faces their greatest challenge. Not the empath's anger, not their resentment, not their revenge, their independence, because independence cannot be manipulated easily. An independent empath is no longer terrified of being alone, no longer desperate for approval, no longer willing to trade self-respect for connection. And that changes the entire power structure. What once felt like a relationship of necessity becomes a relationship of choice. And once someone realizes they have a choice, everything shifts. The empath starts asking different questions. Does this relationship add value to my life? Do I feel respected? Do I feel safe? Do I feel appreciated? Are my needs important too? These questions sound simple, but they are transformative. because healthy relationships can withstand these questions. Unhealthy relationships often cannot. As the answers become clearer, the empath begins accepting a difficult truth. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. Not everyone deserves endless patience. Not everyone deserves repeated opportunities. And perhaps most importantly, not everyone deserves to remain in their life. This realization doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from wisdom. Wisdom earned through experience. Wisdom earned through disappointment. Wisdom earned through finally understanding the difference between helping someone and losing yourself to them. At this stage, the narcissist often becomes confused. The person they once considered predictable is now unpredictable. The person who always stayed is considering leaving. The person who tolerated everything is setting boundaries. The person who constantly sought approval no longer needs it. It's a transformation they never expected. Because they underestimated the empath from the very beginning. They mistook kindness for weakness, patience for passivity, compassion for dependency. They never realized that the empath's greatest strength was quietly developing beneath the surface all along. And now it has emerged. The truth is, narcissists are irresistibly drawn to overly empathic people because empaths provide what they crave most: attention, validation, understanding, emotional energy. But what makes the relationship so fragile is that these gifts are not infinite. Eventually, the empath starts recognizing their own value. Eventually, they stop measuring their worth by how much they can give. Eventually, they realize that healthy love should nourish both people, not drain one to sustain the other. And once that realization fully takes root, the dynamic can never return to what it was before. Because the empath finally understands something that changes their life forever. Their purpose was never to save everyone. Their purpose was never to fix everyone. Their purpose was never to sacrifice themselves for people unwilling to grow. Their purpose was to care deeply without abandoning themselves, to love sincerely without losing themselves, to help others without becoming responsible for their choices. And when they finally embrace that truth, the very quality that once attracted narcissists becomes something entirely different: a strength protected by boundaries, a heart guided by wisdom, a compassion rooted in self-respect. And that is the moment the empath stops being irresistible to narcissists and starts becoming unreachable. Because the person who once gave away their power has finally learned how to keep it.